Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. Coming up tonight, the US election goes down to the wire. Is childhood under threat? And Ivanka Trump's reinvention as an influencer. The US election is underway, with polls opening across the country earlier today. And we've already had one result. The 6 residents of the tiny New Hampshire village of Dixville Notch cast their votes at midnight. The result? A 3-each tie between Harris and Trump. Looks like the pollsters called it right, for once. Elsewhere in the country, voters began to queue from early morning. In a suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana, the queue wrapped around a parking lot as people waited hours to cast their ballot. There were similar scenes outside this Islamic center in Dublin, Ohio, with voters lining up around the block. And these were the scenes in Maryland, with voters queuing up long before the ballot boxes had even opened. Those queues are only expected to get longer as the day wears on, with every indication that voter turnout will be high. That's a result that could benefit Donald Trump. That's according to his campaign anyway. One advisor told CNN this: "We feel like we're in a position now where if the people who we think are going to turn out for President Trump turn out, then we ought to win. So it's a matter of achieving that. It's close. It's really close. I hate to sound so ridiculous. Oh, it's turnout. But that's really what this comes down to, and the only thing we're focused on right now." One early voter was Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, who spoke to reporters after casting his ballot.
You never know until you know, but I feel good about this race. I felt good about my own race a couple of years ago when I voted in this exact same spot. Hopefully it goes as well for President Trump and me as it went for me a couple of years ago in the state of Ohio. Well, look, I think our message is, first of all, we do expect to win, but obviously no matter who wins, half the country, as you said, is going to be at least partially disappointed. I think my attitude is the best way to heal the rift in the country is to try to govern the country as well as we can, create as much prosperity as we can for the American people, and remind our fellow Americans that we are all fundamentally on the same team, however we voted.
That's a nice message. Except it's a memo Vance's boss didn't seem to have received when he gave his final campaign speech at a rally in the battleground state of Michigan last night.
You're going to say, Kamala, you're horrible at your job. You don't know what you're doing. You're a low IQ individual. We want smart people. We want cunning people. We're dealing with the smartest people in the world. We don't want you negotiating nuclear deals because you don't know what the word nuclear means. Kamala, you're fired. Get the hell out of here.
This morning, Trump and wife Melania headed to the ballot box too. After voting in Florida, he spoke to reporters.
Look, regrets. You always have regrets. I can't think of any, to be honest, to use her expression. I can't think of any. I ran a great campaign. I think it was maybe the best of the 3. We did great in the first one. We did much better in the second one, but something happened. And this was the best. I would say this was the best campaign we ran.
Democratic candidate Kamala Harris hasn't cast her votes yet, but she did call into Atlanta's V103 radio station to get the vote out in the swing state of Georgia.
On the cusp of this historic moment, you could be the first female, second African-American, and first HBCU graduate to become president. Have you had the time to take that all in? And if so, what has that felt like?
Honestly, I've just been so focused on the task in front of me. The reflection has only been about making sure that I'm responding to the needs of folks around the policies. So, we got to get it done. Today is voting day, and people need to get out and be active. The polls close at 7 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to encourage everyone in Georgia to get out and vote. Go to iwillvote.com. And that's what my focus is right now today, I must admit, which is making sure everybody knows the power of their voice through their vote.
Interesting comments from J.D. Vance, Trump, and Kamala Harris. I have to say, Trump is the one who seems the most bitter, rancorous, angry. Besides his final rally in Michigan last night, Trump also held an earlier rally in another swing state, Pennsylvania, with 19 electoral college votes to play for. It's the biggest of the battleground states. But in recent polls, Trump and Kamala Harris have been pretty much neck and neck. Well, Novara Media's man in America, Richard Hames, was there last night talking to some Trump mega fans. Here's a taste of what happened.
What do you like about Trump? You're here for a Trump rally?
Oh, yeah, Trump on the border, Trump on the economy, Trump on everything. MAGA, that's it. Up and down, left and right. MAGA!
We've been talking to people about this poll that's come out. Iowa poll, Harris 3 points ahead. Does that concern you?
That's not real.
Yeah.
That's not real.
Yeah.
A lot of them polls are fake. I know you know that. You're from England and you know that.
I'm from England, I know that. I know exactly that thing. Yes, is that right?
That's true.
What will happen if Trump loses, though? What do you think is going to happen?
You really think he's going to lose?
I don't know, but it's 50-50.
It's
So,
not 50. That's misinformation.
Yeah.
I think that the American people are going to do what they need to do, and I think that we're going to protect ourselves and protect our children and protect, our rights and the American dream, quote unquote, that they are correct, that they are trying so hard to destroy the freedoms that we have, that they're trying so hard to destroy. And I think that we will appropriately.
I got a poll for you.
Yeah.
Look at all these people here and go to her rally.
We went yesterday.
There's your poll right there.
We went yesterday. Their line was actually a bit longer.
I doubt it. You're trying to get me upset, and I'm not going to let you do that.
They all had different color hair, I bet you, and they didn't know what gender they were. So
They were real
we're not
normies,
worried about
actually.
those people.
You gotta keep
So.
They were real normies. He could just about get himself heard there. You can catch the rest of that video, as well as our team's other videos from across the US, on our YouTube channel, of course, Novara Media, or novaramedia.com. And if you want to stay on top of what's happening across the pond tonight, the US team will be staying up late this evening to bring you the latest coverage on Novara Media's social media channels, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, etc. All very easy to find, Novara Media. As always, none of this would be possible without our supporters, you, or at least I hope that's you. So thank you. And if you're enjoying our coverage, particularly in the US, and you want to see us do more of this kind of reporting, please consider joining our community of supporters. You can sign up today by heading to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. It really does make all of the difference. And we could not exist without our supporters. We want to get bigger and better. Our strapline was new media for a different politics when we started. We still believe that very much. I'm very happy to say I am now joined by Michael Walker. I wasn't muting you on purpose, Michael, I promise. What are your thoughts with just hours to go now until we get the first exit polls for this presidential race?
This was all just my silent protest after your cruel words on Friday, Aaron. But after ripping out the wire from my microphone, hopefully everyone can hear me. I suppose, sort of going back to the first question you were asking, it is comically close. Or you could say, the modeling is comically useless. I know Nate Silver, who's sort of the big guru here when it comes to what we're supposed to expect. He said he's ran 80,000 simulations. I still don't really understand how it works when you do a simulation for an event which only happens once, but he ran 80,000 simulations and Harris won in 40,012. So obviously there it couldn't get much closer. In terms of, looking at it from afar, you would think that Trump would win, right? And the reason I say that is because Trump has outperformed the polls in 2016 and 2020, and the polls are neck and neck now. So presumably, if he outperforms the polls again, even just a little bit, he wins. He wins the Electoral College and he is the president. Now, smart people who I follow on Twitter have been saying you can't make that inference because the pollsters also know that. And so they have been, I suppose, correcting their own models, or sort of attempting to correct their own models and saying, we always underestimate support for Donald Trump. So now let's tweak the models a little bit and assume there are some shy voters. So the question is, have they managed to internalize that? And some people suggesting they might be overcorrecting. So they're saying we don't want to underestimate Trump's support again. So let's tweak the model a little bit. Now, this isn't just saying they sort of pick a number out of a hat, but obviously they can sort of give different weightings to different types of voters and say, we thought these low propensity voters weren't going to vote last time we did the model. This time we're going to say maybe they will vote. So basically it seems like we can't get much from the polls at all. There are some smart people I follow on Twitter who are saying, they're actually quite confident now that Kamala is going to win. Bhaskar Sankara is one of the Merrick Levitts from Fox. They're both saying they now think that Kamala might have the edge. I got no goddamn idea who's going to win this election. In terms of you were saying, does Trump seem desperate? I mean, he does, but did he not also seem that way before 2016? I feel like that was probably also the case then. So I'm not sure what we can infer there in terms of what internal polling they're getting. I mean, what is strange is, I was listening to the Elon, I don't know if you listen to it, Aaron. It's right up your street, but the Elon Musk sort of 3 hours with Joe Rogan. And it is just bizarre how, I mean, people disagree with me on this, but I think he clearly is in many domains a genius, to have revolutionized space travel, electric vehicles, and, potentially AI, potentially Neuralink. Clearly the guy's intelligent. But in the first 5 minutes of that, they were just talking for ages and ages and ages about how meat has no impact whatsoever on climate change. And then they speculated that this was all just completely fabricated by the lobby of companies producing fake meat, right? As if they think that sort of Linda McCartney with her frozen sausages has more power than the entire meat industry, which is one of the most powerful lobbies in the world. So you do have a lot of really bizarre people saying really odd things. Now, is that out of desperation, or is that what they believe, or is it sort of just their cynical way to try and get themselves over the line? Very difficult to say. I am quite excited about this election this evening. I feel a little bit like, obviously, lots of sort of the American newspapers are saying, how do you sort of control your mental health tonight? I know there will be lots of American people very worried about Donald Trump winning. There is also an element where it is quite, it is a bit exciting, like a sports game, isn't it? Like, who is going to win this? Obviously, I hope it's Kamala, even though I think she is a pretty weak candidate. But as far as I'm concerned, it could go either way. I should say, Bhaskar, who's confident that it's Kamala Harris, is going to be on tomorrow night's show. So either I can mock him for being completely wrong, or congratulate him for his foresight and ever-present wisdom.
I think that's fair. I think anybody who's really confident about the outcome just is not familiar with politics. I would say that I think we are being offered actually almost, the ideal form of really online shit posting, the world's biggest podcast, in fact, well, America's biggest podcast, certainly, but also by extension, the world's. The 3 biggest podcasts in the US right now, not politics podcasts, are all basically putting out Trump propaganda. I think 3 of the last 5 guests that Joe Rogan had on the world's biggest podcast, J.D. Vance, Trump himself, and of course Elon Musk. That's 3 of the last 5 guests. The only Democrat he's had on is John Fetterman, who's hardly, a radical leftist. And then on the other hand, of course, you've got Democrats with their ground campaign, knocking on doors, et cetera, et cetera. And it does really feel like an amazing test case of online meme culture, podcasts, new media, versus how campaigns used to operate back in the day. And also, by the way, a real big dependence on legacy media, particularly TV, which, no doubt about it, Kamala Harris absolutely enjoys an advantage there. So whichever way this goes actually has real lessons, I think, for us here. I don't know about you, but I used to love reading as a kid. I would spend hours reading Roald Dahl, horrible histories, Ladybird books, anything I could get my hands on, really. But that experience of reading as a young person for pleasure is apparently becoming more rare. That's because, according to a new survey by the National Literacy Trust, just 1 in 3 young people say that they enjoy reading in their free time. The Guardian has written up that story, and the details make for grim reading. They say this: only 34.6% of 8 to 18-year-olds surveyed by the National Literacy Trust, NLT, said that they enjoy reading in their spare time. This is the lowest level recorded by the charity since it began surveying children about their reading habits 19 years ago, representing an 8.8 percentage point drop since last year. It is also part of a broader downward trend since 2016, when almost 2 in 3 children said that they enjoyed reading. Reading frequency is also at a historic low, with 20.5% of 8 to 18-year-olds reporting reading daily in their free time, compared with 28% last year. Those are extraordinary numbers. Just to repeat, in 2016, 2/3 of kids liked reading in their spare time. 2/3, 66%. Today, just 8 years later, it's 1/3 of kids, so 33%. It's halved, if this survey is to be believed anyhow. What's more, that precipitous fall appears to be accelerating, with an almost 9% fall last year alone. And there's a similar annual fall with daily reading frequency. So we've got a longer term problem, and it's getting worse really quickly. The Guardian goes on to say this: the gender gap in reading enjoyment has widened, with 28.2% of boys aged 8 to 18 now saying they enjoy reading in their free time, compared with 40.5% of girls. We know that children who read for pleasure and children who are read to gain all kinds of benefits, from increased vocabulary to vastly improved mental well-being, said Children's Laureate Frank Cottrell Boyce. But today's survey shows that too often as a nation we are withholding those benefits from our children. He described the benefits as an invisible privilege. Of particular interest is how this fall is most acute among young people in secondary school. 3 in 10 pupils in secondary schools reported enjoying reading in their spare time, compared with more than half of primary age pupils. Now, obviously, these are extraordinary numbers, as I've already said, and that can't be dismissed because, among other things, this survey itself is absolutely enormous. The National Literacy Trust put these questions to 76,000 children and young people aged 5 to 18 earlier this year as part of their annual literacy survey. So methodologically, it's very robust data. So let's look quickly at some of the explanations for this apparent trend. Of course, to find that out, where else better than X? First up is the idea that kids' books have basically become really weird. This is from Ricardo Autobahn. You mean kids aren't excited by somebody who was on TV in 2008 writing a book called The Bottom That Saved Christmas or something? Now, when I read that, I thought they were joking until I started to look at children's books, which are indeed rather strange these days. Here is one that really stands out. The Fart That Changed the World by Stephen Mangan. By the way, this theme, this scatological theme, is quite common, it turns out. There are so many children's books about feces, as I've discovered over the course of today. The Poo in the Zoo, The Poo That Grew, I Really, Really Need a Poo, A Day in the Life of a Poo. What's going on here? This seems rather strange. There's even a children's board game called Poo Bingo, although you have to be over 3 years old to play that because of choking hazards, which are presumably tiny little poos. Anyway, another slightly more serious explanation for the fall in reading for pleasure among children and young people came from journalist Taj Ali. He isolated government cuts. 800 libraries have been closed due to spending cuts since 2010, a fifth of the UK's total, and many of those that remain have seen their opening hours cut. I think that's obviously indisputable. The question is it feeding through to adolescent reading habits? Personally, though, I think this tweet captures it best. This is from Ben Sixsmith. This is terrible, inexplicable. I must spend 10 more hours on my phone trying to work out what could have happened. Effectively, the insinuation there is that because of the move to a digital environment and access to smartphones and mobile internet, kids are reading books less. My sense, personally, is we overprotect kids in the real world. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't go to bonfire night. Meanwhile, we underprotect them in the online world. You know, you can't walk to school, but you can access a device where you might encounter online gambling, strong violence, pornography. Seems kind of weird to me. Maybe I'm unusual. I don't think I am. And I think this story is also a part of that. Namely, we haven't really grasped the downsides of children and young people having access to smartphones all of the time. We're still working this stuff out as a society. Michael, am I being a Cassandra? Do you think children are reading less? Why? And does that matter?
Well, I mean, I think they're reading less because the evidence is there that they definitely are. I think it matters. I mean, I'm with you. I think this is all about the phones, right? And I mean, like many people, I was reading this story on my smartphone. I was in the gym at the time, you know, so it's sort of like you're in between exercises, you're sort of scrolling and then you realize, oh, I've just spent 5 minutes on my phone. I'm not actually doing any exercise. And you can apply that to so many different areas of your life. And I mean, smartphones are something I think about a lot because I just think the revolutionary impact of them for our lives and our society, we haven't got to the bottom of yet. And I suppose the significance of it, you can just all feel personally. Right? I feel like, what did I used to do in those in-between moments? Because the moment now, I can't, even going for a pee, like going for a wee is too long a period of time for me not to look at my smartphone. So I get my phone, and then I'm scrolling through it while I'm doing that. I'm thinking, what did I used to do in those in-between moments? Right? What did I used to do when I had sort of 20 seconds spare to think? And I think I think probably I read less books than I would have done if it weren't for smartphones. There are potentially some upsides. I think I know more about the world with a smartphone than I would without, because I learned so much from podcasts. I learned so much from history podcasts, for example, and various politics podcasts. And it might be the case that young people are not reading books, but they're still sort of better informed because they're doing various things on their phone, which are to some degree enlightening or enriching. But no, I'm very worried about it. And I think we're seeing this across so many different areas of life. We've talked before about Jonathan Haidt, who talks about the effects that smartphones seem to be having. Again, it's very difficult to establish any sort of provable causal link. But what's often the case is that you look at how trajectories have dramatically changed since around 2010, which is when sort of the mass public started to have smartphones, and not just being sort of like something that was happening among a minority of people, but when sort of everyone basically had them and was using them all the time. So he looks at how it damaged teenage mental health and how that seems to correlate with when people got smartphones. And he sort of says that it's affecting girls more. That's because they have smartphones more. Of course, it seems to be the opposite here, doesn't it? Girls are still reading a lot more than boys, even though, according to Jonathan Haidt, they tend to use smartphones for social media more than boys do. I was reading a really interesting Substack yesterday by someone called Alice Evans, who's a social scientist at KCL. We talk about fertility a lot on this show, Aaron, and population. She was saying that actually a potential hypothesis as to why fertility really collapsed since 2010. It's been on a downward trend for a long time, but it really collapsed in a way that surprised the people who do projections at the UN, for example. Could be because it's harder to form relationships in a smartphone era, right? And I'm really worried about what they're doing to all of us. And it just seems, any explanation that involves smartphones sort of seems, in a way, inherently plausible, because you can see how much it has changed my own sort of personal relationship to the world, that I'm spending 3 to 4 hours looking at this thing every day. And it doesn't seem surprising at all that would be stopping kids reading so much. Maybe because directly, instead of reading, they're looking at their smartphone, but also indirectly because sort of the applications that we use on smartphones seem to have a deleterious effect on our attention spans. Also, I think the data was showing, wasn't it, that it's a lot more dramatic among secondary school kids than it is among primary school kids, this decline in reading, which would make sense because obviously in secondary school when kids start to get smartphones. So yeah, I'm worried, and I blame the phones.
I think that's a really good explanation, Michael. Also, your point about young girls, young women reading more than young boys, and yet them being more intense, voracious users of social media. Such a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but it's a great counter argument to the phone's sort of hypothesis, which, look, I don't think it's a hypothesis, it's real, right? We've got lots of data across lots of countries with regards to this. And people might be thinking, oh my God, they sound like, reactionaries. I think phones are great. I think mobile phones are great. I think the internet's great, but you can have too much of a good thing. And I think as a society, like you said, this is a really radical, revolutionary technology, really disruptive in terms of social and individual habits. We've got to work out a way of navigating that, right? And simple.
Another upside is if we want good, Bookstagram is a real thing. I only discovered this when my partner's a novelist, and when he released his book, it was quite big on Bookstagram. But sort of Goodreads, all of these books have you've got thousands of people writing reviews with multiple paragraphs. And so again, it's one of those situations where, on a macro level, it seems that on average, if we are going to associate it with phones and social media, it seems to be causing a decline. But there are these sort of bright spots where actually social media can be used to dramatically increase people's interest in reading.
Last week, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, outlined the first budget of the new Labour government. And it was big. We had the largest tax rises in decades announced. In fact, last week's budget involved £40 billion of tax rises from 2025 and £70 billion over the next 3 years. That is primarily so the government can spend more on public services. And meanwhile, the minimum wage rose by 6.7% to £12.21 an hour. Breakfast club funding will rise by 300%. And carers will now be able to earn up to £10,000 without losing the carers' allowance. All fantastic news for working class Brits. At least you'd think. But there was only one problem, because this is all being funded by taxing private jets, finding more from inheritance tax, increasing stamp duty on second homes, and increasing employer national insurance contributions. How could you, Rachel Reeves? Don't you understand? The point is to give the wealthy tax cuts while making life harder for everyone else. I'm not joking when I say that, by the way. That was the literal Tory playbook after 2010. In his first budget, George Osborne increased VAT, which of course we all pay whenever we buy stuff, and 2 years later, he cut the top rate of income tax for the very richest. Unbelievable. Don't Labour know that's how you get hashtag innovation? After all, the 2010s was such a success. Productivity didn't move for a decade. Life expectancy started to go down. Surely we want more of the same. The response across the media, though, in all seriousness last week, was wild to say the least. A budget that doesn't completely crucify working people, how could you? That's not to say Labour got everything right. For instance, they removed the £2 cap on bus fares for starters. But their position was essentially to invest in public services by taxing the wealthy and business. So something very much at odds with the last 14 years. Fortunately for them, however, the faces of the resistance could not have been more politically convenient, because James Dyson and Jeremy Clarkson soon became synonymous with calling out Downing Street. Oh no, James Dyson, the guy who supported joining the euro, then supported Brexit, but still relocated his company HQ to Singapore anyway. How will Labour ever recover? And then there's Jeremy Clarkson. I'm sure he's a lifelong Labour voter. After all, he's very close personal friends with David Cameron, the former Tory Prime Minister. And he literally went on record in 2020 saying he bought a farm partly to avoid inheritance tax, which is what he's now incensed about, by the way. Again, I'm not making this up. In a 2021 interview with The Times, Clarkson said that avoiding inheritance tax was the, quote, critical thing in his decision to buy Diddley Squat, his 126-hectare farm. But a more reasonable and, I think, informative conclusion can be found from this person. Meet George Weston. He's the chief executive of Associated British Foods. They own iconic British food brands like Ovaltine, Ryvita, and Twinings, all the brands your grandmother loves, basically. But they're also the parent company for Primark, the largest budget clothes retailer in both the UK and Ireland. And according to Weston, the budget was actually quite good for the kinds of people who shop at Primark. He told the FT that it was quite hard to look at this budget and say it was a good budget for the high street, citing the usual points of a higher minimum wage and higher national insurance contributions for employers. That's not good. However, he also added something else, saying there is, quote, more good news for the least affluent in the budget than bad. And he subsequently predicted that would lead to an increase in consumer confidence and a, quote, very good Christmas for Primark. So, in other words, rising real wages, which aren't new, falling costs of credit with interest rate cuts, and now this budget, which included a big hike to the minimum wage. That is all going to leave those on lower incomes better off. Personally, I find that more useful information than the rantings of a man who bought a farm in part to avoid inheritance tax, but who now can't. And Michael, what did you make of the media response to the budget last week?
I didn't know that about Jeremy Clarkson, because obviously what we're hearing about these farms is that we've had this farm in our household, in our family for centuries, and we don't even make any money for it, but we're keeping it for sort of, I mean, people, they keep sort of suggesting sort of patriotic reasons. These are people who are devoting their lives to tending the land, and now we're going to dare to tax their properties. It's still sort of the floor is still really high. This is people with sort of farms worth multi-million pounds who before were avoiding tax and now they're not, and we're supposed to care. But I hadn't realised that Jeremy Clarkson was complaining about this, even though he definitely doesn't fit into this category, which I'm not particularly sympathetic to anyway. So we've had the farm in our family for centuries. He just bought it literally to not pay inheritance tax. I love that. I agree with you. I think lots of the pushback to the budget was ridiculous. I suppose maybe one place where I would sort of demur slightly is that there is, I think the big story here wasn't necessarily taxing the rich. They did do that in some respects. There were some sort of headline figures, but where they did increase taxes on rich people, capital gains, inheritance, and private jets, as you say, the sums weren't particularly significant. The vast majority of that £40 billion increase in tax was on national insurance. Now, they'll say this is on the employer's side of national insurance, which sort of technically is taxing bosses. But Jonathan Portes, the economist who I had on the day of the budget, was saying, and I think this is fairly convincing, that basically, it's essentially the same as adding national insurance to the employer's side, because it's still a tax on wages. What will happen is that businesses will be less inclined to give people pay rises, or they'll employ less people. So it will have the same effect as reversing the national insurance cut that the Conservatives did before the election. Now, I personally think this is good. I think broad-based taxes to pay for decent public services is not a bad thing. But it is very interesting that sort of if the papers wanted to attack the budget, they kind of could have got on that. They could have said, this is a budget which will damage jobs. This is a budget which will stop you getting your next pay rise. Now, as I say, I think that's worth it if what it gives us is decent public services. And I think it's correct that the fellow from Primark is saying that ultimately this will make my customers better off, because we will benefit when we have better public services, for example. So I agree with that. But it is interesting that the newspapers have gone down a completely different route, which is crying about people with very expensive farms, which shows you where their priorities are. Also interesting, I mean, because it's so why maybe political parties shouldn't be that nervous about doing things like increasing broad-based taxes, because people don't really mind paying an extra penny if it means that the NHS is going to collapse. And that's essentially what we're doing here, really.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, Novara Media is an organisation which pays people PAYE. We're going to have to pay more. But like you say, it's a really strange one. We could talk about this all day, but I find it really odd that when we talk about quote-unquote business in this country, the fact that 1 in 100 reported rape cases, sexual assault cases, ends up in a successful prosecution, that is seen as fine, but bumping up national insurance contributions is like, you can't do that. Or shoplifting en masse. There are some stores near me, Michael, they are going to close because they are rinsed every single day. They're rinsed every single day. So them paying slightly more on the national insurance contributions for their employees is not their major problem. Their major problem, actually, when you speak to businesses on the high street, it's rent, it's energy costs. Of course, increased labour costs are part of it, because minimum wage as well going up. And again, in this budget, that happened too. But yeah, it's rent and energy. And for some stores, like this one I'm talking about, a co-op near me, shoplifting is a huge problem. Not every business, but many businesses. And your point about Jonathan Portes is really interesting, Michael. I'll come back to you on this quickly, because I think what's happened here is, strangely, we've had this really progressive move where Jeremy Hunt cut employee national insurance contributions from 12 to 8%. So, everybody who pays national insurance contributions has made a saving there. And that effectively has been moved over to employers. Now, in large part, you're right, that then feeds into lower wages for workers or lower wage growth. So, for instance, there'll be many businesses out there that were planning to give a 4% pay rise next year to workers. Now it's going to be 2.5% because they've got to pay that bit more on payroll for their employer national insurance contributions, which have just been increased. But not every business will do that, right? Some high profit businesses will swallow that. Others will find efficiencies. I saw a story of, I think it was a fish and chip shop. They said, well, our model really during the holidays is to hire loads of temporary staff and students. We can't afford to do that anymore. And I'm thinking, good. You want to disincentivize that stuff. If you want to increase productivity, which is a country we're going to have to do, you absolutely want to disincentivize that kind of employment. They said, we're probably going to have fewer staff who are more productive. Great. Yes. pay them better wages, and have a more productive setup with regards to your business. So I buy your argument, but I think looking at it holistically, like I say, employee national insurance contributions reduced, effectively that's now been swallowed by employers. I think that's actually quite progressive. And it's quite ironic that, Jeremy Hunt was half of that move. The Tories were half of that move. The fact that they cut national insurance for employees from 12 to 8% whilst they were running a £120 billion deficit, they knew what they were doing. They were really trying to screw Labour over for the budget that came after, which is, of course, what we just had. But still, I think actually, all things considered, it ended up being rather progressive. New Tory leader Kemi Badenoch has unveiled her shadow cabinet. Now, given a massively reduced parliamentary Conservative Party, it's fair to say the pickings have been slim when it comes to political talent. It really does show. Priti Patel was the first contender to be knocked out of the Tory leadership race. Formerly the Home Secretary, Badenoch is now letting Patel loose on the rest of the world as Shadow Foreign Secretary instead. That's perhaps a fitting role given her love of travel. Because in 2017, Patel held secret meetings with Israeli politicians and officials in Israel and New York while Secretary of State for International Development. When those meetings came to light, she was then forced to resign. Inventor of the cruel and useless Rwanda scheme while Home Secretary under Boris Johnson, Patel also oversaw a clampdown on legal protest as Home Secretary. And evidence was found that she breached the ministerial code following allegations of bullying across three ministerial departments. But an intervention by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson kept her in post. A second to be knocked out of the leadership race was former Work and Pensions Minister Mel Stride. Something of a non-entity, he's now Badenoch's new Shadow Chancellor. Rather important job for somebody who basically nobody's heard of before. While Work and Pensions Secretary, he tried to push through reforms to the Work Capability Assessment for people with disabilities and long-term illness, making it tougher for them to access benefits. And he once declared that GPs shouldn't be allowed to sign people off work because they were too close to their patients. I, a politician in Westminster, know more about your patients than you, a trained doctor with a decade's worth of education, speaking to the person in question. In with a massive promotion is Tory party whipping boy Chris Philp. Always first to hit the media rounds during a Tory government scandal, and boy, there were lots of those. The former policing minister is now the new Home Secretary. That means we might get even more golden moments like these.
How do they? But the point is, that the person who exercises that right to buy, by definition, is somebody who was on the social housing register. They then exercise their right to buy, so the number of people on the social housing register goes down by one.
No, but what about all the people on the social housing waiting list?
Yeah.
Where are they going to live?
But the balance between stock and people stays the same because each goes down by one. You then, separately to that, you build
the people
more...
on the list obviously can't.
Right, so separately...
Am I missing something?
No, you are. Because separately to that, obviously, you have to build more homes to meet the inflow, right? So that makes sense. But look, the more general...
Does it?
If you think about it, it does make sense. No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent to Rwanda.
They're not from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from Congo.
And they're supposedly
Okay.
warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. Definitely. You're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda?
Trade unions, and what happened this afternoon was halfway through these negotiations, while they were ongoing, the unions came out onto the street and gave an impromptu press conference, I mean, there's TV footage, saying that the strike was going to continue.
OK, let's just pause. Hang on.
I mean, it's on video.
Mick Lynch, excuse me. Mick Lynch, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question.
You are a liar.
Right, let's just hang on.
There's a video of him walking out this afternoon giving a press conference. It's on videotape.
And then we went back to the talks.
Yeah,
You're
having said the strike's going to go ahead.
You are a liar.
It's like if American Psycho was an estate agent in Romford. The Tories want a Patrick Bateman tribute act to be Home Secretary, and Philp's promotion to one of the shadow great offices of state may be the biggest shock of Badenoch's new cabinet. and also a sign of some desperation. Another of her leadership competitors, Tom Tugendhat, was reportedly offered a top cabinet job, but swiftly turned it down. Meanwhile, Tory leadership runner-up Robert Jenrick has been appointed Justice Secretary. That reportedly followed intense wrangling over what post Jenrick might fill in Badenoch's top team, with one source telling the BBC this. Kemi just doesn't like Rob. She thinks his whole shtick about her and whether she has any policies has done her lasting damage with the right and with reform voters. This is only likely to further unravel. How is that helping Kemi Badenoch? How is that? He's now in the shadow cabinet. You're briefing against him, saying that Kemi doesn't like him. How is that helping her? I mean, that's the sort of thing, if I was Labour, I'd make up. Anyway, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, I guess. In other big jobs, Robert Cartledge is the new Shadow Defence Minister, me neither. Laura Trott takes on the education brief. And Edward Argar, not like the posh oven, is now Shadow Secretary of State for Health. Michael, I'm not going to lie. I studied political science for the best part of a decade. I look at politics for a profession. I've literally never heard of some of these people. Can you help me?
Oh, Aaron, Labour should be shaking in their boots that Robert Cartledge has been given defence and Edward Argar has been given health, because these are some big hitters. These are politicians who know how to chair a meeting. I've got no idea who some of these people are. The Priti Patel one is funny, isn't it? I mean, it is amazing that sort of you can have in your past losing a job as that wasn't Shadow, was it? That was at the time Minister for International Development, and going off and having freelance meetings, not with any old government, but with the Israeli government, right? And not telling your party leader. That is, it's difficult to recover from that kind of thing. And then to get the job as Shadow Foreign Secretary, I should say. In a way, it is that Robert Jenrick appointment that is the weirdest, because the whole Tory leadership campaign, I mean, it was fought over a number of things, but the big dividing line was that Robert Jenrick said, we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights. We can't do anything we want to do if we stay within it. And Kemi Badenoch saying, no, we can do what we want to do within the European Convention of Human Rights. Let's not leave it. That would sort of cause more problems than it would solve. And you can see how sort of she could still have him in the shadow cabinet after having beaten him in that race. But you would have thought she would have to put him in a department where it had nothing to do with the one thing they disagreed on, right? If she'd put him in health, for example, if she'd put him in the DWP, that could have made sense. But if their one sort of defining disagreement was over a issue which was sort of directly under the jurisdiction of the European Convention on Human Rights, then putting him there seems like you've just won the leadership only to concede one area of policy to the guy who disagreed with you most vociferously in that particular area of policy. So it seems to me just a little bit incompetent, in the sense that this looks like it's just storing up problems for the future. And, obviously Robert Jenrick likes to do a big dramatic resignation to say, I'm the real torchbearer of the Tory right. So that just seems like something that's going to inevitably happen down the line. In a way, I'm glad we don't, we might never really have to learn these people's names, some of them. Right, the Tories, I don't think they're going to be in power for a little while. Hopefully, this doesn't seem like a sort of political party that's sort of ready to hit the ground running and make a success of themselves. Yes, they are 1 point ahead of the Labour Party in some polls, but I do think that Labour will recover to some degree from that low, and I can't see why the Conservatives will. So hopefully, Robert Cartledge and Edward Argar, was that who it was? Hopefully,
Argar, Michael.
Hopefully we won't become much more familiar with those two gentlemen, who I'm sure are, very distinguished, intelligent fellows.
Well, I think Mr. Cartledge, the Right Honourable Cartledge, he'd been a great pick for Health Secretary. It fits. It works. Anyway, it's pretty funny, isn't it? We talk about infighting on the left. My goodness. I think we ain't seen nothing yet, right? The briefing has already begun with Kemi Badenoch, and it's like watching rats fighting in a sack. We've seen a lot of Donald Trump over the last few months, and we've even seen a little bit of Melania. But what's happened to the Trump kids? We haven't seen much of sons Eric and Donald Jr., who were both key figures in Trump's presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020. And even Trump's younger daughter, Tiffany, rumored to be her father's least favorite child, made appearances back then. Well, last night at a rally in Pennsylvania, there was something of a Trump family reunion. If you can hear explosions outside, I just want people to know, in the UK, we have Guy Fawkes Night. It's tonight. There is not some, there's not some attack. This is not January 6th comes to Novara Media Towers, I promise you. That was Eric and his wife, Donald Trump Jr. and Tiffany Trump with her husband. And while he wasn't at the rally, Trump's youngest son, Barron, got a mention in the former president's speech. But notably absent was Trump's golden girl, his older daughter, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner. Both played significant roles in Trump's last administration, with Ivanka named official first daughter and advisor to the president. Meanwhile, Jared Kushner, formerly a lifelong registered Democrat, became Trump's senior advisor. And he was put in charge of brokering peace in the Middle East. Not exactly a success, it's fair to say. So where are they now? Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump subpoenaed in January 6th investigation, as you can see there. Perhaps that subpoena last year, requiring them to testify to a grand jury over Donald Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection, put them off politics a bit. Or maybe a Senate inquiry into Jared Kushner's equity firm over foreign influence spying earlier this year scared them off. Or could it be that after spending several years as a social pariah for supporting her father's presidency, Ivanka Trump has decided it just isn't worth it? Don't you love it when entitled rich kids learn actions have consequences? But perhaps I'm being too harsh. Perhaps the Kushners really have just seen the light. Because on the eve of the US election, Ivanka Trump took to Twitter to post this thread. This past week, I turned 43. Reflecting on life's lessons, here are some truths I've learned along the way. So what were some of those truths? Well, there was this. Family and friends are everything. Nourish these relationships, check in on them, and let people know you care, even across distances. As Esther Perel says, the quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life. Number 2, forgive people. It frees you more than anyone else. Then there were these gems. 11, there's 17 I think in all, we won't go through all of them, they're not all as profound. Cultivate self-mastery. As Marcus Aurelius said, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Focus inward. True strength lies in controlling your response, not the world around you. It's so easy, by the way, to be into stoicism when you're a millionaire. Outside things don't matter. They kind of do matter when you can't afford to pay your rent. 12, guard your peace. Epictetus, this is another Stoic philosopher. Epictetus observed, anyone capable of angering you becomes your master. Mastery over self means others don't control your state of mind. Number 13, be open to the truth wherever it leads. Listen, reflect, challenge, and grow. Cultivate creativity and expansion in life and embrace new ideas, connections, and art. But this was my personal favorite. Number 17, thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Carl Jung. What you judge, you cannot understand. Instead, observe, study, and learn. Here's to another year of growth, love, and meaningful moments. Ivanka, what are you doing? That was just some of Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump's 17 tips for living, and not a single mention of the election, the world's most important election, in which her father is running to be president of the United States. It's all rather strange. Michael, Ivanka Trump was one of the most powerful women in America while still in her 30s. I think, just reading some of those, she wants to be a bit like Michael Walker, you know? She just wants to host a podcast.
I'm sure she'd be great as well. I'm just going through her 17 tweets now. I think they're full of wisdom. Number 15, approach people and life with love and positivity. Dolly Parton said, I don't criticize and condemn. I love and accept. I mean, this is fabulous. I'm all for Ivanka Trump's new career. It's much better sort of telling people to sort of find peace within and accept themselves and treat people with love, not disdain. I like the Carl Jung one about sort of if you judge, that's the opposite of understanding. So yeah, fabulous. I was interested. I hadn't realized she was sort of completely silent about Donald Trump. When you go through her Twitter feed, she hasn't said anything whatsoever about the fact that her father is running for president. Obviously, she wants absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, it potentially does say something about sort of what a second Trump term would be like. I mean, it was probably always a bit nonsense when people talked about Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner as being maybe moderating forces on Donald Trump the first time around. Jared Kushner, of course, was the envoy, was that his name, to the Middle East, and he was sort of big behind the Abraham Accords and what was supposed to be what did they call it, the deal for the Middle East or something like that, which was basically going to be de facto the annexation of all the Palestinian territory. So these weren't moderates, but they weren't necessarily sort of within the kind of the particular ideological project that is distinct to Donald Trump. They were more just sort of your standard neocon Republicans. So it will be interesting if he does win the election. Is he going to have a much more ideological gang around him than he did last time? Last time it was sort of whoever he could get on board, whoever was most proximate to him. Obviously, so many people from his first term, even his own children, now don't want anything to do with him. Most of the people who sort of were part of his administration and didn't have a good time the first time around are now coming out and actively saying this man is unfit to be president. Presumably Ivanka Trump thinks either that would be a bit too far because he's her father or because she's too busy finding peace within to warn people not to vote for her completely insane, anti-democratic, dangerous father. There we are. I suppose maybe that's the flaw with Stoicism. It leads you to sort of say these somewhat vague truisms as opposed to make interventions where you could really have an effect. If she were to come out against Donald Trump, that would make a difference. So if that's the outcome she wants, maybe she should step up and take some responsibility.
Hitherto, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. The point is to change it. I mean, this stuff, particularly Stoical philosophy, which has really had a huge, like just insurgency, intellectual insurgency, particularly off the back of Silicon Valley over the last 10 to 15 years, like certain editions of Stoical philosophy, Seneca and so on, being published like by people like Tim Ferriss, rather, who's a podcaster, very close to a lot of these guys. You've got just a real longing for this stuff. And I feel that there's a political dimension to all of that, which is that, as I kind of hinted at, you don't want to talk about material economic deprivation because, of course, you have everything. So you talk instead about the anguish and the anxieties of the soul. It's about not judging people and things. So look, let's do that once we've got the 40 million Americans off food stamps, Ivanka. Of course, that might require something of a redistribution of wealth. Take a little bit of money off your husband and you and give it to other people. Michael, before we go, a prediction, please. I have not a gun. I don't want to be too violent with my imagery here. I am saying to Michael Walker, you lose everything you care about if you don't tell me who you think is going to win. Who is it? Trump or Harris?
So the pressure is to give you an answer, not to get it right.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, the Trump, you have to, if a lot was riding on it, Michael, forget your reputation, forget what you want.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm going to say is people who I trust in the United States, who presumably sort of are closer to sort of what's really going on than I am, are now at this point saying Kamala Harris. I still do think that there is a case where sort of something beats nothing. And I do think that Donald Trump is, I think he's terrible. I think what he's offering is a disaster, but there is something so shallow about Harris and Waltz. I want them to win. Don't get me wrong. I want them to win. But what we saw in 2016 especially was you sort of had a candidate that wasn't really offering anything and a candidate who was sort of like a big, bold character. And I'm worried we have the same dynamic again, which means I'm going to say Trump with zero confidence.
It's so hard, isn't it? Because, just statistically, normally the incumbent wins. That's a very easy thing to work off of. And that was the best argument for Trump in 2020, of course. But this isn't an incumbent. That's the weird variable for me, Michael, is that you have two newcomers, which is unusual. It's not that common. You get it, sometimes you get it in 2000, Al Gore, George W. But it's not the most common.
We got it in 2016, didn't we?
Yeah, you got it in 2008 as well, of course, McCain and Obama. But it has that dimension of a former president being there as well, which you think, your gut tells you, all things being equal, a former president, there's no incumbent. And like you say, he has that offer. So you're going against that Seltzer poll, which seems to give a pretty decent lead to Democrats in Ohio. You think that's wrong, Michael?
It was in Iowa, wasn't it, where it gave them a lead in Iowa?
Oh, my apologies, not Ohio. Sounds similar, nowhere near.
I am maybe I shouldn't admit this as, a political commentator, but I do kind of have an attitude to these polls where I'm sort of like, I'm going to passively absorb them, but ultimately I'm going to just wait until the results come out. I spent, I've been listening to lots of podcasts about like ancient history instead of sort of obsessively looking at these polls, because I'm like, I can just find out in the goddamn morning.
Or maybe not.
That's not offering much to our audience right now, is it?
Or maybe not. No, that's true. But, it's important to say the last time in 2020, we didn't find out the result really until the Saturday. And it could be the same. It could be the same now. Although I have to say, the exit polls and the early states declaring often gives you a pretty strong inclination of where things are going. Let's see. I will be staying up, not all night, but I'll be staying up. And if you are also watching events unfold tonight, make sure to at least check in occasionally on Novara Media's Instagram and Twitter or X accounts. Thank you, Michael, for joining me this evening.
Yeah, let me just say, even if you're disappointed with my predictive or my commitment, let's say, to predictions when it comes to this presidential election, you will not be disappointed by Novara Media's analysis tomorrow. We will have all the best analysis of the American elections with the founding editor of Jacobin, Bhaskar Sankara, and then everything you need to know. We might know who's won the presidential election. Maybe we won't, but we will have a hell of a lot of information and insight to deliver.
Yeah. And just to be fair to you, Michael, I know I've asked you who you think is going to win. I'm also thinking Trump because I'm 50-50 and all my cognitive biases and my political biases would incline me towards Harris. So I think it's Trump. I think Seltzer is wrong. Thanks to everyone for watching tonight. Of course, we'll be back tomorrow for another show. That is with Michael from 6 p.m. Do not miss it, of course, given what's going to happen between now and then. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.